Before we start, I'd just like to make a couple of observations. Professor K focuses on the potential regulation of market structure rather than market behaviour, although he does express a hope that in the long run we'll see less rather than more regulation. I'd like to applaud this approach because many of the issues we're talking about here have at their heart human interaction and human behaviour. I'm not a die-hard believer in the efficient market hypothesis, but markets are nonetheless complex and dynamic organisms, and blunt intervention can sometimes have unforeseen consequences. The mandatory disclosure of directors' pay is perhaps a case in point. I'm certainly not arguing against the detailed disclosure of directors' pay, but I think we need to recognise that this disclosure has facilitated pay inflation, as many companies have sought to award directors in the first or second quartile relative to their comparators. This has been inherently inflationary. Of Professor K's 17 recommendations, I find myself in agreement with 14 of them, neutral on 2, and opposed to just 1. Recognising that I'm fundamentally supportive of most of the recommendations, the question for me is how one can best take them forwards in the most effective way. Professor K's report is primarily addressed to a UK audience, and speaking here in a European context, I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that different jurisdictions have different market structures and different things work in different places. My own specialisation is corporate governance, where culture is just as important as rules. And in this area, at least, I'm doubtful that a one-size-fits-all solution is appropriate, beyond perhaps defining a limited number of general principles. At its heart, corporate governance is very much a local discipline. This leads me to be cautious about advocating a lot of upfront legislation to force detailed behavioural change in market practice, particularly at a European level. We need to find ways to persuade the investment industry that many of the recommendations contained in Professor K's report have merit, and for the market participants to take steps on their own volition to implement some of the necessary changes. The UK approach to greater gender equality on boards might be a useful template. In this instance, companies were required to set themselves targets and to report on a regular basis on the progress they are making towards achieving those targets. There is a specific threat of further legislation if progress is deemed to be unacceptable over the passage of time. We will see how this approach works, but the early indications are that companies have clearly received the message and matters on the ground are changing rapidly. One recommendation in particular we like at Fidelity, and which I'd like to highlight, is a recommendation in favour of restricting equity incentive awards to career shares to be held at least until termination of employment. This mirrors our own internal approach to incentivisation, and by locking in and aligning the interests of managers and shareholders over the long term, career shares should also enable companies to simplify what has become an overly complex discipline. And we've talked about this already, but complexity, in my view, is clearly the enemy of accountability. The only recommendation which I pose is the one relating to the establishment of a formal investors forum, which I question is workable from a purely practical perspective, but I'm sure we'll talk about that more as the discussion develops. But I look forward to our debate. Thank you.